Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the 8th Annual Attallah Lecture. My name is Josh Greenberg. I have the pleasure of serving as the Director of the School of Journalism and Communication and Head of the Communication and Media Studies program here at Carleton. The Attallah Lecture is one of several events that are scheduled during the Faculty of Public Affairs Research Month. Launched by our Dean, Andre Pleward, FPA Research Month celebrates the contributions of our departments, of our faculty members, of our graduate students, the contributions we make individually and collectively to campus life and to life in Ottawa, Canada, and internationally. I want to thank Dean Pleward for his constant support of our program in this evening and to congratulate him on another successful Research Month. Others have also played important roles in helping to make this evening happen. First and foremost, our school administrator, Carol Craswell, who steers our ship straight and without whom none of our events would be possible. Roger Martin, our IT coordinator, who put his creative talents once again into designing our poster. Dave Elliott, our school media producer and studio coordinator, who is recording this evening's lecture. And of course, all of our faculty and graduate students. Please join me in thanking them for their contributions. We're also pleased to once again host this evening's lecture in conjunction with our annual Communication Graduate Student Conference. The conference organizing team, in particular Jessica Wind and Scott Dobson-Mitchell, along with other members of our CGC executive and caucus, deserve our highest praise for organizing yet again an outstanding graduate student conference, which started today and will finish tomorrow. We have students from across Canada and internationally, and it's great to see so many of them in attendance this evening. Paul Attallah, whose name we hold this evening's lecture, was an important figure in Canadian communication studies. He was the author of two key texts that for many years were staples in the communication curriculum at Francophone universities, and his co-edited textbook, Mediascapes, introduced thousands of students to the field. Now, when I arrived at Carleton in 2003, Paul was the associate director of the school and head of what was then the mass communication program, and it's a position he held for 12 years, making him the longest-serving associate director and program head in the school's history. Paul's students remember him as a remarkable teacher, and in even the largest lecture theaters, he was a gifted and compelling storyteller. We remember Paul for his quick wit and his strong personality. He always had a clever response and never shied away from debate. Paul was genuinely curious about why people hold the views they do, whether we were talking about the effects of reality television, the negative turn in political advertising, the necessity of Canadian content regulations. Paul always pushed us to explain ourselves. His demand to know why we hold certain views is, I think, what made Paul so curious about media audiences, which he argued hold the ability to decide for themselves what they consider enlightening and entertaining, far be it for the state to make those decisions for us. Cancer took Paul from his family, friends, colleagues, and students much too soon, and we're grateful to the Attallah family for allowing us to honor and remember Paul with this annual event. Now, I know I speak for my colleagues on faculty, our staff, and our students when I say that we're absolutely thrilled that Dr. Mia Consalvo accepted our invitation to deliver this year's Attallah Lecture. Dr. Consalvo joins a prominent group of international scholars who have headlined this event in the past. Toby Miller, Lisa Parks, Lisa Nakamura, Gabriella Coleman, Andrew Chadwick, Jack Halberstam, and last year's speaker, Kate Crawford. It's an eclectic group, to be sure, and their respective records of scholarship tackle a wide range of topics and concerns. The death of television, satellite images of declassified bomb sites, the hacker collective Anonymous, queer theory and gaming, and the trappings of big data. Now, despite their topical difference, all the Attallah lectures share in common a commitment to presenting stimulating and thought-provoking ideas and arguments about core issues facing communication studies today. Now, the rise and development of games in the gaming industries is one of these issues. Digital games have become a pervasive mainstream form of cultural expression and a key driver of technological and economic development in Canada. In 2015, Canada's games industry contributed approximately $3 billion to the GDP. There are more than 470 game studios in Canada today, and the sector employs directly around 20,000 people, many of them young Canadians. The video game industry in Canada is growing by leaps and bounds and gaining ground on film and television production as a major contributing as a major contributor to the Canadian economy. A couple other interesting data points. 19 million Canadians, over half of the national population, are gamers. And this splits almost evenly between women and men. Yet we actually know very little about how people play games as part of their everyday lives. Our distinguished speaker is one of the most prominent game studies scholars in the world today, and her work squarely focuses on some of these issues. Dr. Mia Consalvo is professor and Canada Research Chair in Digital Game Studies and Design in the Department of Communication Studies at Concordia University, where she runs the mLab, a space dedicated to developing innovative methods for studying games and game players. She's president of the Digital Games Research Association, which is the premier international association for academics and professionals who research digital games and associated phenomena. She's the author of many books, including Cheating, Gaining Advantage in Video Games, and more recently, Atari to Zelda, Japan's Video Games in Global Context. Prior to joining Concordia, she held positions at MIT, Ohio University, Chubu University in Japan, and the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. Dr. Consalvo will speak for about 50 minutes. There will be lots of time for questions. There are mics in the middle aisle. I'll ask you to use the mics because the questions will also be recorded. And we invite you to join us in the atrium for reception afterward, where I hope we'll have continued but informal discussion. Without further ado, please join me in warmly welcoming our speaker this year, Dr. Mia Consalvo.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This is a subject that is near and dear to my heart, so I'll probably be quite excited as I talk. And I would like to thank a couple of people first before I get into the discussion. Carolyn Zhang is a graduate student at Concordia, and she did a large number of the interviews on which this research is based. And Thorsten Busch was a postdoc at Concordia with me for a year, and he helped with the analysis, and the three of us have co-authored some papers based on this research. And also just a blanket warning that I will be talking about multiple video games, perhaps revealing some endings, some surprises, so I'm sorry. All of the games have been out for a while now, so you should know better, okay? But, just put your hands over your ears if there's a screenshot that feels like it might reveal too much. So this is also kind of about how my research has, going back to those roots with cheating, how and why people cheated, some of my early theorizations about that. I thought I was done with the topic, and it turns out that some of the same issues and concepts kind of come back. Cheating, dilemmas, magic circles, how do we play? How do we make sense of that play? To give you just a very quick overview, if you didn't read my book on cheating, which asked what does it mean to cheat in a video game, I didn't really know what I was doing at the time. This was my first work with video games and video game players. I made the wise choice not to define what I thought what cheating was and ask people what they did or didn't do. I just went to players and said, what do you think cheating is in a game? What do you do? What do you not do? And that was the right decision because there were just this plethora of answers and discussions and debates about what it means. There was a little bit of common ground. Everybody could agree that cheating is something that gives you an unfair advantage in a game. And this could be in a single player or a multiplayer game for different people. Some people thought, well, you can't cheat in a single player game. You can only cheat against humans, so it has to be multiplayer. Some of you are shaking your heads. There are other people who said, oh no, you can cheat in a single player game. And when I said, like, what would that mean? Like, what constitutes cheating then? If you're not cheating another player, people would say using a cheat code, looking up some answer in a walkthrough or an FAQ. One player said, anything outside of your own head. And I said, well, does that mean, so asking your sister? He's like, cheating. Okay? So there's this really kind of diverse and rich range of responses. And kind of one conclusion is, players are active, they're thoughtful, they're diverse. People might cheat wildly in one game, but totally, disavow it in another type of game. Their definitions of what cheating was might change over time. There's this industry that kind of grew up to encourage some forms of cheating, like all those walkthroughs that you used to be able to buy before the internet got big. If you remember the game Genie, that was a device that allowed you to cheat. But what it did was it challenged, I argued at the time, this magic circle of play. And one other caveat I should just note, if you're curious about cheating, is that everybody cheated, but almost nobody wanted to. And so at the end I said, players, there's this idea that there's this magic circle, which Johann Huizinga talked about, this bounded space where the normal rules of life don't apply. And the best example people always give is the boxing ring, where it's perfectly acceptable to walk up to somebody and punch them in the face and others cheer for you, whereas if outside of that ring you go up to someone and punch them in the face, you might get arrested, right? The normal rules of life don't apply. And I said, well, maybe these games are spaces where people can try out cheating behaviors. And even then I was unsure because some people said, I just can't cheat, like, I don't want to do it. It ruins the sense of accomplishment that I get from games. And so it's really kind of a last resort. Then it went a little polemic. And this was in reaction to a talk I heard that there must be a magic circle for play that we must legislate. And so it was like, all right, fine. Well, there is no magic circle. And I was critiquing the circle mostly through discussion of this one case study, MDY Industries versus Blizzard. If you don't know it, Blizzard publishes World of Warcraft, the massively multiplayer online game. And MDY was this small little company, a couple of guys who created the WoW glider. It was a piece of software you could install onto your game. You attached your character to it, and it would run your character through a loop that you designed in the game, an area that you set, and turn it on, you could go to sleep. And then your character would run through, would fight all the monsters that it encountered, pick up all the loot. So in the morning you would wake up and your character's bags were full of loot and maybe you had leveled up. And Blizzard really didn't like this. And they said it's circumventing play, it's destroying the value of the game, and it went to court, they settled. But what I said was that the magic circle really doesn't handle contingencies very well, right? It's this structural definition, it's a circle, but it's in clash with this contextual dynamic gameplay. This was a bot, software that somebody had developed to circumvent the normal ways that people play. Now, I mentioned also the normal rules of life, the daily routines, and that the magic circle kind of stands outside. And if you look closely at what goes on in games, especially multiplayer games, you'll know that there are plenty of daily life actions going on in games. There's currency. People like to buy and sell things. They even bring real-world currency in. Now in many games it's legal and encouraged. A few years ago it was actively discouraged, but plenty of players did it. There's scarcity of items. It's a game. Why can't we just have everything that we want? Well, it turns out we don't like that. We like to earn things. That also relates to status displays. People like to show off what they have. There's competition in games. There's racism. There's sexism. There's all kinds of problems with toxicity in games. There's the grind. There's lots of things about daily life that we bring into games that make us think that maybe they're really not so far set apart. I think now, there is maybe a little way to salvage the idea of the magic circle. I'm not going to talk so much about it going forward, but I think what's interesting about it is maybe it's not such an impermeable boundary, but what's interesting now is how players talk about gameplay. Because I think players like to invoke that sense that these games are spaces apart, and that's what's going on when people are saying, oh, it's just a game. It's like, oh, that violence in games, it doesn't really have an effect on me. It's just a game. It doesn't mean anything. And I think they're invoking that. I also think there's something interesting going on now when people are saying that's not a real game, and that's kind of going back to that as well. But I'm going to put the magic circle kind of on ice for a moment and go on to sort of the next research topic that I was interested, and I will come back at the very end. So game choice. Players are presented with lots of choices in games. Sid Meier, who created the Civilization series of games, is credited with saying, basically, a game is just a series of interesting choices. Will I do A or B, or will I try C, or whatever? Rawlings and Morris wrote a textbook about game design where they kind of expanded a little bit and said, well, to be worthwhile, those gameplay choices must be non-trivial. And I think that's what Meyer actually meant by interesting choices. You know, it's not just the blue ribbon or the pink ribbon, but that those choices have to be meaningful in some way. And then there's Miguel Sicart, a theorist of gameplay, who said game design must, whoops, I think I condensed that quote a little bit. He talked about game design and how players react to it. And he said players react to dilemmas not with a moral stance, but with their player logic, if game design does not treat choices well. So for example, if you attach rewards or punishments to certain choices, then many players will then just actively assess what will help me the most, what will hurt me the least. And the idea of the moral framework kind of goes out the window. He talks about that as the player logic that kicks in. So that's another consideration, you know, that I've been thinking about and that I think is very interesting in how players respond to games. Not all players do this, but it is a big element. But a lot of the research about game choices is about the games themselves and how they're designed. And my background is always going back to the players, and so I'm always curious about how do players actually respond to these systems, what do they do, how do they think about it. And this is totally made up. But if you look at kind of what research there is about how do players respond to games, what choices that they make, this is kind of roughly what people say, is that most of the time people play good. And then there's the couple people that are like, and they're the ones who enjoy being evil. And so I was curious, is this really what's going on? You know, where's the complexity? How can we understand it? And so the research that I did was to investigate how game structures, the presence or absence of choice, so those choices that we mentioned, things like the length of a game, the avatar that you're given, or the character that you're allowed to create. The systems themselves impact players and how they relate to them. So not just like, do you choose A or B, but how do these other things come together to impact player choice? And also, how do players rehearse their ethos through play? And it wasn't coming out of nowhere. So I taught these classes before on ethics in games, games and cheating, games and play. I'd had students, undergraduates and graduates, who'd done interviews with other players who were kind of reflecting back the same thing. Lots of people, first of all, people love to talk about this topic. They will bend your ear for hours if you let them, and myself included. But many of them would say they default to good, or there's a couple who like to be bad. And so I thought, well, we should do some more systematic research. So with Carleton, we did these structured interviews. This is a few years ago. And we were targeting mostly people who played games like the Fallout series, Mass Effect, Dragon Age, Fable, and I think The Walking Dead had just kind of gotten released when we were doing the research. And kind of an important caveat here, this is how some players approach moral decision making. This is, we can't claim a representative sample. And these are people who were particularly passionate about it because they responded to our call. We were also lucky, I know a developer at BioWare who retweeted my tweet, so we got lots of people who enjoy BioWare games, like Dragon Age and Mass Effect. But they're people who are really invested in moral choices. There are quite a few people who play these sorts of games where the moral choices may be one element that it's not particularly compelling. Maybe they just use that player logic, balancing out what's the most advantageous thing for me. But we were interested really in those people who, for them, the moral choice was like a key component. Okay, so I'm focusing mainly on them. And in thinking about this and trying to theorize it, I'm asking myself, what's being studied? Are we studying the players and their identity, who they are? Are we studying their performance in a particular gameplay session? Are we interested in their general style of play? And you can see the cheat answer there is yes, all of it. But at the end, I'm going to come back to maybe how to think about these things in relation to each other. But in the beginning, it was just how do these things work? And I want to stress being evil or good isn't monolithic. it's not consistent. Some players, just like with cheating, would say, in this one game, I was morally upright and outstanding. In this other game, I was totally, horrible to everybody I encountered. Sometimes they said going through the game, something happened that triggered them to play completely differently. But, for many people, there was a certain rhythm to what they did. Another kind of key thing that we found was that the first playthrough was particularly memorable for people, and other research bears this out as well. Even if you play a game multiple times, people would talk about that first playthrough as special. Some of them referred to it as like the canon, like that's kind of what really happened. Other people said, well, I might play a game multiple times through. The first time is kind of what I do. The second time is to sort of experiment with, other choices along the way. And we tend to focus here on the first playthroughs, mainly because they were the most meaningful, but I will make references to the others. So, confirming the prior research, most players that we interviewed did say they like to play on the side of good. And I just have some player quotes that I would like to share because they're particularly eloquent about it. So for Malcolm, playing good isn't actually a choice. He said, I can never be evil. I always go with the paragon type decisions. Josie said she's always a goody two-shoes, often to the consternation of her fellow players. She said it became a running joke in Dungeons & Dragons campaigns that my little cleric would always make little speeches about how she was fighting for justice, and all the other characters would always roll their eyes and say, oh God, not again, but, I don't want to be evil. I like being nice. People said that it was tied to their personal sense of identity. It was just who they were. Sometimes they did talk about shades of gray appearing, so they would say like, oh, I tend to play this way, or I usually play that way. They'll play around with the system. But like Emmett said, I always find the evil side more fake. I've tried playing a lot of evil characters, especially on second playthroughs, but it always feels less like I'm concerned with the moral dilemmas than I'm choosing the evil option because I've decided to play an evil character. And so a lot of players stress to us that the good option's more in line with their natural disposition or moral alignment. It's tied to what feels right for them. One player early on in one of those class interviews told someone like, this is just the way I was raised, which is sort of heartwarming, you're like, well, that's good. But, it also is reinforced by the games themselves, because in most of these games, you're supposed to be the hero. You want to save the world, so why wouldn't you want to be heroic in many senses? So the game is rewarding you with its own logics for doing those types of things. There were a few people who decided that, or who do play as evil in their primary playthrough. Some of them said, this is just the way that I enjoy playing. A couple of them said, well, it's not really me, but it's this character that I've created. I didn't even really but I set this character kind of on that path. But others really did kind of enjoy it. So Sam, who played Knights of the Old Republic 2, said at one point, I did an evil cackle. I may have even done the evil hand gesture. Not sure, I think that. Or yes, this one. And then I did it because I was like, he was talking about force pushing a character off a bridge. He was like, I did it because I was like, this is awesome to do this totally different thing that I wouldn't normally do and just get away with it. Okay. And other people, apparently Knights of the Old Republic was a good one because people who played this game had lots of examples of, something that triggered them. Somebody else said, well, she had started playing as good, but then there was this major plot twist in the game. And then she said, I decided my character would now be evil. He would now work to destroy everything he had helped build because those he trusted most betrayed him, used him for their own purposes. And once I chose to be evil, there was no going back, regardless of how heartfelt my former friend's pleas were. And then she watched a cutscene that showed her friend pleading. She murdered her. And then I felt goosebumps, a chill of watching my evil decision reap its evil consequence. And then she assured us, as a person, I would never do anything like that. But as a rule, I try to be good-hearted. I had never before felt so evil. It was both horrifying and exhilarating. Of course, if you've got the people who feel like they need to be good, and then the few people who like to be evil, there are the people who, kind of try and walk the middle road. They try and build consensus. Jonas said, I've always been a mediator. I've always sought compromise. These are people who like to use, build up those persuasion skills that some games offer so that they can, opt out of the violence to get people to go along with them. But not all games let you do this, As you can see here, this is from the Dragon Age series. They pretty much push you, are you going to support, throughout the campaigns, the mages or the Templars who are basically at total odds with each other, and you have to choose a side at some point, right? And so players would say, at that point, I had to make a choice. The way that some players resolve this is they will say, well, then I'm going to do another playthrough to see what happened. Of course, the challenge here is, and this is going back to those game structures, these games, some of them take 60, 70, 80, 90 hours to play. And so it can be, practically impossible, at least for some players, to go back and do that. Alice said, many people she knows, including herself, won't get around to finishing this second time, so they'll miss out on playing the bad guy. So she says, if I feel like playing the bad guy first time, I just do it. Richard said second playthroughs result in a declining interest, so that even if he tries new options or experiences, they usually result in moral choices he doesn't feel engaged in. So there's this real problem. Second playthroughs are usually more about experimentation with the game mechanics, the alternate storylines. There's kind of an emotional reserve that's going on there. I just like this photo from Fallout of you can actually detonate a nuclear bomb in it. And yeah, you're not the good guy there. So going back to this idea of game structures and how those push people beyond just the choices that are offered, characters and avatar representations also influence player actions and choices. So this is from Dragon Age. In the first one, players had a choice, not just of would you be a mage or a warrior, but of different backstories. Depending on if you were an elf, you could be the city elf and live in the alienage, or you could be the country elf, and you had a different story that led up to one common meeting point for all the characters. And people liked this as a way to sort of set a character. Sometimes, they would not just, some people would use these as ways to kind of role play, and set this very different character. Others would choose one that would kind of align with their own sense of self or who they think they would be. We found that for at least some players, the avatar was kind of this empty vessel that was the proxy for me. This is me, these are my decisions that I'm going to play through. And some people even said, I think of them as my own decisions I made. I would project my own emotions onto the player character and their relationships. I usually become emotionally invested in their story and what happens to them. One person said, I create the way the character looks and what their backstory is, so often they take on a lot of my own characteristics, physically if I'm feeling like it, and definitely morally. So, people play and create sometimes characters that not just act like themselves, but also look like themselves. And let's see. This is also compounded again by that sense of the length of the game. And so the longer that the game goes on, the more choices that you're making, the more deeply invested that players are going to get in them. For some players, it wasn't that the avatar was necessarily, this vessel for me, but that the avatar was a better me. Warren said his avatars probably represent an idealized state of who I'd like to be, and games with difficult situations make spaces where he can make choices I can be proud of. So if it's a war-torn world and, you have this difficult path to walk, you're going to be the noble hero who walks through and you will save the world. Another person mentioned Skyrim and said his character was an idealized version of me with more bravery and self-control. For Josie, her in-game avatars are a slightly idealized version of a smarter, faster, more capable version of your actual self. And, other research has looked at, for example, avatars in spaces like Second Life, where In Second Life, you can be literally anything that you want as an avatar, but many people opt to just be thinner, younger, more beautiful versions of themselves. And it's kind of playing through a little bit here as well. You know, people are creating these idealized versions of themselves in how they look, but also in how they act. There was one interesting caveat. One player mentioned to us, no matter how much you try to be yourself in a game, there's always the reality that it's a game and the decisions you make aren't real. The heightened level of violence in games makes it so that your decisions are very far from ones you would have to make in your daily life. I know that in Dragon Age, I would cut the head off of Loghain, but I would never be able to behead someone in real life, no matter how evil they are. Right? So players are acknowledging, well, this may be an idealized me, but hey, I don't think I could do that with a sword. So if you've got empty vessel, idealized me, and then you've got I am not my avatar, and this is just Walter White because I like that photo. But people who said, I am not my avatar did so for different reasons. In some cases, players felt the game had set itself up that didn't allow themselves, it didn't allow them to place themselves in the character's role. For Wesley, playing games like Oblivion and Skyrim is magnificent, but he says, I never feel like my character is a reflection of me for various reasons. One person said, Commander Shepard is a really strong and well-defined character, such that when making tough choices, I sat down and thought about what would my version of Commander Shepard do. I imagined, well, this is what she's seen in her experiences. This is her experience of the Geth. I think she would make this decision. So some people really do this role play where they think these are kind of the characteristics and this is what the player would do. So that's definitely not me who's doing it, right? And sometimes this can result in choices that the players aren't happy about. It's curious, even if they're role-playing, they're not happy with the actual decisions that they are making because it's different from maybe what they would do on their own, but they feel like they need to be true to their character. And it's also just kind of important to remember that for all of these are staged versions of themselves. Even if people are saying, well, this is me, I am the avatar, they're still rehearsing something, they're still playing through something. It's not that they are actively, taking on these physical actions. They're testing them out via gameplay. So if people are testing and playing, what does this say if you're playing as evil, whether you're enjoying it or not? Players, for the most part, did not consider game spaces as this judgment-free zone, even for their own play, let alone the play of others. They admitted there's feelings of discomfort or shame, sometimes more were appropriate for deviant acts they took in game. So even if they decided, like, I'm going to be evil, they felt bad, they realized, like, maybe I should feel bad, right? Sometimes they differed. There were a few people who said, like, oh, this is a space where I can do whatever I want and I'm not going to feel bad about it. One player mentioned the Sims and drowning their Sims and setting them on fire and, like, okay, the game, I can do that. I'm not going to feel bad about it. There are boundaries. Other people said, well, it made me feel bad, but I have to live with the consequences. Again, going back to Mass Effect, there was a choice to reprogram the Geth separatist robots. How often do you get to say that? And this caused her great discomfort with the choice that she made, and she paused and considered, but then she decided she was not going to change her choice, even though she felt terrible about it, because I forced myself, not to go back and change it. This is the story as I'm creating it. There were other players who gave just these wrenching discussions of choices that they made. Some of them even mentioned having to stop playing after they made these choices. A couple of them stopped playing games altogether, the particular game. Some of them said, I just needed time off after making that choice. Sometimes they did go back and change things, but it was interesting to see their justification for why they wouldn't. And of course, this could be limited to a particular choice, or it could extend to an entire playthrough. Faith mentioned, she had decided in Dragon Age to side with the Templars, even though in her first playthrough she had sided with the mages. She wanted to unlock, the alternate storyline. And I said, sometimes players feel more disengaged in that second playthrough. For her, she felt like utter crap when the final decision was made, despite it making perfect sense for the character in question. And Storylines weren't the only way players can experience discomfort, so players' in-game companions offer support or criticism. One player told this great story about Baldur's Gate, where she was new to the game. This is ways back. She was young. She recruited these companions. She didn't know the companions were all evil, and so when she did good things, they all hated her, and she was like, what's going on? Why don't you like me? And she had to do bad things for them to like her, and then she felt bad about them liking her because she was doing bad things, and she was just totally confused about what was going on. Somebody who talked about playing The Walking Dead, Jose, said he had made his decision to shoot a particular character who was threatening him, and Clementine, this young girl you're protecting. And, if you know The Walking Dead, like when you do these certain things, like this line will appear sometimes. This one says, Clementine witnessed what you did. And you don't know at that point really what the outcome of that will be, but it's this interesting marker. I think it's actually ingenious. Nothing even really needs to happen. It's just that players see that, and some of them just freak out. So Jose said, I chose to kill him. Then it was revealed that this girl that you're caring about was right there watching you kill this guy. I just felt awful. I felt so bad. I can't believe I made that decision because I thought about my moral decision in that case, and I was like, I really don't know if I should kill this guy, but he's a threat. I'm going to do it. And so after I weighed my moral decision and then committed to it and made that act, then I see the repercussions, and then my decision is that much more meaningful to me because I know it just wasn't about picking between A and B. I genuinely thought about it, and now I still have self-doubts. So there's these ways that these games create these systems for players that just still kind of mess with them and make these situations even more complex. This is from Life is Strange, which was not out when we did these interviews. I'm going to talk about it a little at the end. But this game offers an interesting mechanic, actually, where you can go through the game. Like you can see here, you can speak to the principal, and you can tell him different things. And it offers you the ability to rewind and respond differently to see how the scene will play out. The game is limited in that you make a particular choice, and then once that scene ends and goes on to another, you can't rewind and change your final choice. But it offers player that option. Players, in other types of games where you don't get that, would have to literally go back to an earlier save to try things out, or sometimes they would say, no, I'm just gonna, stick with what I've done. But many players do go back if they can to play through multiple times because they think either that's not what I wanted to do or it didn't turn out the way that I expected it. I just need to change things. So it's not just the game's narrative and interactive structures, but it's the technical and other features that may seem separate or neutral in terms of morality, such as the use of autosaves or manual checkpoints, the ease or difficulty of returning to certain decision points, the overall length of a game, and the opacity or clarity surrounding the ramifications of player decisions that all contribute to how players approach gameplay and moral dilemmas. And so, how do players think about other players' decisions? So, people judge themselves, they do, in their own gameplay, but then we ask them, how do you think about how other people play games? And it got really interesting. People wouldn't say, she plays evil, so I think she's evil. But they did draw these links between how people play and their individual personalities. And so Sandy said her brother is one of the most nonviolent people I've ever met. He also likes to do his first playthroughs of games as the villain. While she believes that such acts are purely for entertainment and fantasy purposes, she also told us, I'm not going to say I don't judge people a little for making what I view as evil choices in a game and not caring about the outcome. There was a lot of I don't know what it says about somebody, but it says something. They were like, I can't put my finger on it. There was a little bit of judginess going on. Malcolm said he'd had big arguments with his best friend because his friend decided to play Mass Effect as a renegade. He said, I know he isn't like that, yet he's making those decisions. So he was able to do that while I wasn't able to, so he obviously sees it differently. He rationalized this as, he's playing through it for a storyline, while I play it through for my storyline. But it still caused this big upset between them that his friend would play like that. In thinking about why this is, why might people say these things, I'm not entirely certain. If we think about communication theories, maybe it's the third person effect where, you think, well, I'm not influenced negatively by this media, but other people certainly are, so maybe that's what's going on. Another alternative is it may not be that I'm so concerned about, the way that Rebecca's playing, but it's about the way that I'm playing, right? Because, like, let's say that I think that I'm playing as me, and I'm playing as good, and I see Rebecca playing as evil. If I play as me, then I think it's a reflection of me. Well, then I think that must be a reflection of Rebecca. And so what does that say, right? And so maybe there's some of that going on. And so I've mentioned the systems a little bit. We asked the players also explicitly, what do you think of these particular systems? And typically they had lots to say. So, a lot of it was frustration. Even as much as they love these games and enjoy them, they really critiqued the systems that were in place and wanted more complexity. So, for example, some of them said lots of games really kind of boil down to, oh, well, do you save the puppy or kick the puppy? And that's not really a choice. This mostly came up in relation to morality meters. And so this is like a trope that you see in a lot of these types of games. Raymond calls them oversimplistic and shallow. Samantha considered them poor design. I think it sucks. Somebody mentioned the Mass Effect Paragon Renegade system, which is basically you're not good or evil. It's more like you're kind of altruistic versus selfish. But he called it the Gary Cooper Clint Eastwood mechanic. Somebody mentioned, kind of in contrast to the morality meter, the Dragon Age, the original system, where it's not that you're choosing like the good or the bad option, but the NPCs, like your companions that surround you, will react to you in different ways based on like they have a morality system. So some of them may approve what you're doing if you're being lawless, while others will strongly disapprove, right? So you can kind of see how your choice is reflected back in the characters that surround you. And, another thing that they critiqued is this player logic I mentioned earlier from Sicart, the idea that there may be rewards or punishments tied to these decisions. And this could be in a couple of different ways. So with one, for example, with Infamous, like you're encouraged to play in a certain way such that the more like you're evil, the more of a skill tree you unlock, so that to get the most powerful attack, you have to go, full one way or the other. You can't just, if you tread the middle ground, which you can, you're not going to get any powerful attacks or maybe any particular rewards. Or like several people mentioned, BioShock, and well, do you save the sisters or do you kill them? And they said, well, once you figure out that there are different rewards attached to them, suddenly the morality for them kind of evaporated, and it was just about which is strategically the most rewarding for them, right? And so, for them, that resulted in some dissonance. It kind of took them out of, making a meaningful choice to something where they were just trying to power their way through. But they did really appreciate the interactivity of the games. They said that, this is really what kind of drew them to games. Somebody said, in RPGs, I find moral dilemmas extremely important. This goes to the core of video games as a medium. Someone mentioned, I love this quote, a television character has never made me feel guilty, as opposed to one of her companions in one of these games. Sandrine said, I project my own emotions onto NPCs more than characters in books, film, and TV. In other forms of media, my reaction would be, that character's a jerk. Whereas in a game, my reaction is usually more along the lines of, that character was a jerk to me. It feels more personal. So because they're making the choices, it feels like it is being reflected back to them. And some of them said, there was some, kind of dissent here about, like, are there, I don't want choices that are meaningless. Some people said, I like having the illusion of choice, even if it's just an illusion. So there's no, like, neat little bundle to kind of take away. Players are messy like that. But, they really felt like having these options was important. And going back again to that idea of time, Prolonged exposure, those series of choices that add up over time really had an impact on them. This is Lydia from Skyrim, and there's this great quote. The one on the screen is different. The one on the screen says, it's from Skyrim Confessions. I had Lydia as my follower since my Dragonborn was level 3, and I liked her so much I never switched followers. When she died during a fight with a dragon priest at level 49, I was so upset I stopped playing Skyrim for a month. Okay. We had a person tell us, your very first companion is Lydia, and if you go online, you will see thousands of internet jokes and things relating to Lydia because she doesn't say anything interesting. She doesn't do anything interesting, particularly, but you spend maybe 40 hours with her, almost protecting her from her own stupidity. It's true. She will, run in the line of, if you throw a fireball, she's always right there, and she'll die. So you become attached to her, and that's not something you really get in movies or books, that you become attached to an automaton. It's part of the length of it. If Lydia had just been there for 10 minutes or 20 minutes, it might not have mattered. But because she's there for so long, she's the first companion that you get that players kind of grew attached to her, even though, I think some people would say she probably had less personality than the companion cube in Portal. And if you talk to players, they will also say they didn't want to throw the companion cube into the fire. People form these attachments, these bonds over time with these characters that have them respond in different ways. And kind of related to that, even as much as players like the illusion of choice, a lot of what they talked about, in terms of things that were most meaningful, maybe not enjoyable, it went back to this idea of complicity. The game took them somewhere that they didn't expect to be. They may not have enjoyed it, but it ended up being meaningful for them. And games are kind of experimenting with this more and more. So for example, let's see, I'm just looking for my list here. Games like September 12th, Shadow of the Colossus, BioShock, Braid, Red Dead Redemption, Nier, Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, Bastion. This is from Spec Ops: The Line, Grand Theft Auto 5, and Broken Age. All make the player complicit in some way. So for example, if you remember Shadow of the Colossus, it's an old game where you're supposed to go through this world and you're told basically to save this girl, you have to kill these colossi that are in different worlds, and they never attack you, but you have to figure out the best way to attack and kill them. And spoiler alert, at the end you find out, there was this evil creature that was telling you to do this, and you've restored him to the world, and boy, don't you feel bad for doing that. And one of the critiques of this system is it's kind of a one-trick pony. How often can you go along feeling like I'm the hero, and then at the end of the game you're like, oh, I was just a dupe. It doesn't carry through very much. It gets pretty old. But it's interesting to see how games are trying to experiment with that. Spec Ops: The Line is a shooter game, and it puts the player in this situation where things spiral out of control. The game is reacting to you in different ways that really challenges a lot of the tropes of shooter games, that you're the hero saving the world, and increasingly you are powerless, and people are not reacting to you the way that you expect. One of the load screens as you go along in the game asks, do you feel like a hero yet? So it's really kind of challenging this idea that you're taking control and your actions matter, and that you're doing the right thing. So while players appreciate agency, like I said, it's not required. Players feel uncomfortable with it. Complicity pushes players to doubt the magic circle, so they can't keep their ethos outside of it. Part of, I think, also what's going on with complicity is most of the time when you're taking action in the game, you feel like you're justified, especially if you're enacting violence. People would say, oh, well, I can slaughter this room full of monsters, but that's because, they were attacking me, or it was, there was this perfectly good reason for it. And when you take that away, that's when players are suddenly questioning, what's right and what's wrong. And some players just don't like violence, or they have different boundaries for what's justifiable. I just like this quote from a player who played Dragon Age, I didn't want to kill those rams, I felt bad. killing dogs apparently is just one thing that most players do not want to do. You know, they have no problem mowing down rooms full of people, but if you ask them to kill a dog, they don't want to do it. Hellhounds, okay. Like, people always bring up Resident Evil. Those are fine because they're attacking you, but, like, dogs, no. Like, they won't kill the dogs. I mentioned, you know, what's justifiable. I don't have the exact quote somewhere, but somebody had done research on, this is from Modern Warfare 2, the no Russian level. This was very controversial when it was released. You know, you're playing through these multiple missions. This is optional. You're trying to infiltrate this, you know, terrorist group, and they go through an airport and they're gunning down all the civilians, and you can play through. It got a lot of attention. It was actually not played very much. Like, somebody had a statistic for how often it was played, and it was extremely low. You know, players talked about how they felt like it broke a moral compact. Again, you know, like, they weren't accepting that this was justifiable violence. And I think a lot of this goes back to this fact that we've been conditioned to play the hero, that we want to be the good guy. Even if, like, you're kind of the evil guy, it's just like the cool guy sort of dressed up like that. But the games actively reward us for this, and it's this trope that you see over and over again. And if you don't want to do that, like, if you ignore it, well, then you're saying, well, it's just a game, right? Like, again, you're kind of drawing those boundaries. But most of us get judgy about that. So this is my provisional theory. And there's going to be clip art, I warn you now. So I mentioned before player identity, player performance, play styles. How do those come together in thinking about play? So this is you, okay? Drew that myself. So that's your identity, or your identities, right? Who you are. Who you are is, you know, it can change, but let's just say that's kind of roughly you. And let's say that that's your playthrough of a particular game, like your performance playing, Dragon Age. That maybe is me, because when I play Dragon Age, I'm mostly me, except, of course, in Dragon Age I can throw fireballs, but, you know, like, even as much as I want to be evil, I can't, so I end up, like, if I try, I'm going to be a total badass. Like, no, by, like, 2 hours in, I'm, like, helping everybody. It's like, I'm supposed to be saving the world, but I'm like, yes, I'll pick these flowers for you. And so my play performance is, you know, maybe it's a little different from me. There's, like, you know, a little bit, the circle's a little offset because, hey, I am killing things, but it's pretty close to me. And maybe for somebody else, their playthrough is this, where it's still tied to them because they're playing, but the playthrough is actively quite different. Yeah, you can see the blue circle. So, you know, we'll assume again the nice person that is doing all the evil, dastardly things in the game. So you have the player, and you have a playthrough. Like, let's say this player wants to play this game through multiple times. And so, you know, there's a little difference between themselves and their playthrough. And then they play through it again, and, you know, they change things up a little bit. And then they play through a third time. So these are all their performances. They're different performances of the game. And then there's kind of this, I'm just calling it the play style, that's sort of evolved. This is kind of what carries over. You know, you can play maybe differently from time to time, but over time maybe you have a sense of, I usually play this way, I usually play that way. And that's kind of where I think that style comes through. So it's not that you're never going to do anything differently, but that most people kind of center around a particular style of play. And of course, because no model can be simple, your identity is always fuzzy, right? Like, you're not the same person all the time, maybe in different contexts. Maybe you play in one way when you're by yourself, but you play in another way when you're playing with your friends. And maybe you move. So the way that you play when you're 20 is not the way that you play when you're 40. And so you've got players, you've got performances, you've got games. So in addition to this identity and these play styles, the play style and the performances, you've got games that are nudging you in different ways. You know, so they've got different mechanics. There's, you know, they offer not just the choices, but there's the length. Maybe there's plot twists. Maybe there's avatars with interesting backstories. There's all of these elements that are playing into your performances. And again, your identities are shifting. And so it's just mostly like, it's complicated. And the last thing I just want to talk briefly about is this idea of the rhetoric of hero play. Can we all be a hero? Because so many games, that's really what it's about. And I admit, I love it. It's, many times I play a game and I'm like, I just want to shoot things and feel good and like save the world and yay, because most of the day, really, what am I doing? I'm answering email. Well, actually, games now, you can answer email. And they're challenging this rhetoric. This is from Papers, Please, where you can actually, you're playing a border agent. Like if you think that answering email is uninteresting, you're a border agent in a fictional, like Eastern European country, and you have to like check people's papers and see if they should be admitted or denied. And the rules for you change every day, and you have to process as many people as possible, or else you don't get enough money to feed your family. And you can like get people thrown in jail, and gee, do you feel bad about that or no? But it really questions like, well, you're not the hero here, or are you? What's going on? I get the same call every day. Somebody created this. He worked for a call center, I believe, for Canada. And like, he made this little game about basically how it's impossible to please people who call you on the phone, which if you've ever worked for a call service, you know this to be completely true. And again, it's challenging this idea that, oh, you're a hero, that there's a right choice to make, or that there are values attached to it, but it points to some of these absurdities. And I mentioned before, Life is Strange. Life is Strange, you're playing a teenage girl, and it offers you some typical choices. You see this kind of screen coming up more and more in games where, like, at the end of each chapter, this is an episodic game. Each episode is like 2 to 3 hours long. It shows you, like, not only the choice that you made. So the first one is you told Kate to wait for more proof. In this one, the player who posted this, 70% of all players made that choice. So you can kind of see, like, where you stand relative to everybody else. Are you squarely in the majority, or, oh my God, are you like that weird outlier? And it does this for the major choices within each chapter, as well as the minor ones, because, in this quantified self world, we love all kinds of data, including there's even one about you watered the plant or you didn't water the plant. And the game I mentioned uses time control as max. You can rewind time to change the outcomes of certain scenes, and then decide, which is the outcome that you want to have stand. And so it's like letting the player, those players who said, the games are too long, I can't go through them again, or like it's saved and I couldn't go back. It's letting the players kind of experiment. And it actually really kind of plays with that in an evil way. So your best friend Chloe, who you're trying to help in addition to saving the world because your town's going to be destroyed in a week. But Chloe has had like this bad life, and there's this point where you actually go back in time, and her father had died when she was young, and you go back to this point where her father's still alive, and you're trying to keep her father from dying. And basically you are successful, but you're successful in an interesting way with these consequences that you did not intend at all. And then you get to the end of the game, and then there's this major choice about what to do. Do you have the bacon omelet or the Belgian waffle? Not really. But the game is sort of pointing at the idea that these choices may not really be choices that maybe the best thing is to let things unfold, and playing with this idea that you can't be the hero to save the world. So just some final thoughts, just kind of bringing all of these things back together. So players have to negotiate, these procedural rhetorics of the games, the rules of the game for what they're doing. They have to, manage their own sense of agency, how much of their own identity they want to pour into the game or not. And some of that may be dynamic and change. The cultural frameworks that they live in, and that they're going through at the time. And so what that ends up with, or what we end up with, is play this, again, contingent and contextual, kind of like I was mentioning with cheating, with multiple performances that lead to these larger play styles. And so this magic circle is you know, for most people, it's this interesting concept where it's not this staid and stable thing. You know, maybe they use the idea of it strategically to disavow themselves from certain actions, right? They're saying like it doesn't matter because it's just a game. Although it's interesting that they even have to say that, because that means that it does matter in some way, right? Because they're talking about it. And it's definitely not impermeable. And I think that, you know, what's going on, those movements are much more interesting than this idea that we have this space, or we don't. And that's it. Thank you.